Hey, and welcome to my video. My name is Stephen Loynes from Scobas. Today, I'd like to show you 3 different ways of linking Python to a Kivy file. In fact, I'm also going to show you 2 ways where you don't need a Kivy file at all. So we're going to start from the absolute basics. Why am I doing this? Well, because you will be looking on the internet for all sorts of help with your Kivy app. And different people do things differently, and I think it's important that you understand how they do it such that you can adjust it so it works for the structure that you set up for your app.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to the absolute basics of Kivy just to, because in the documentation here there is an example, and I'm going to use this example and then adjust it so I can show you 5 ways of creating the same thing. I am going to go back to basics because I think it's important that you really understand what's happening and how it works exactly. So from the documentation, if you follow the link above, which I will put in the description, the first thing to do is to subclass the app class. Okay, so subclass an app class. We're going to need an app class. We then need to implement its build method. So that's this subclass's build method, and that needs to return a widget instance, so not just a widget but the instance of it, and that will be the root of my widget tree, right? And then I need to instantiate this class, which I imagine is this subclass, and call its run method. Okay, so let's build that. All right, so let's import Kivy. Good practice is to record the version. So in my case, I'm on that. Now, I'm going to need to have a subclass of the app class. So firstly, I need to import my app class. There you go, that's that one. Okay, I will also need to have then when I have my build method, I need to have a widget instance. So I'm going to choose to work on a grid layout. And when I say I'm choosing this, that is because that is the example in the documentation which I'm starting from. So from grid layout, import grid layout. Let's start from there. So the first thing to do is subclass the app class. So create a class. I'm going to call it my app, and that inherits from app. So therefore, that is my subclass of the app class. Now this needs to have a build method. So the build method, cool. And that needs to return a widget. So I'm going to call this root widget, and it needs to be the instance of that. Of course, that widget doesn't exist yet. I'll create that in a second. Now, then it tells me to instantiate this class and call its run method. So I need to instantiate that. So my app instantiated and then call the run method. Right, that's the basics. Now this isn't really going to work because a root widget does not exist yet. So let's create that. So root widget. And I want that to be a grid layout. So I've imported grid layout so I can use it. And now, so the first way of setting up this app is by doing everything in Python. So you're not going to use a Kivy file at all. That's possible. In my opinion, it gets a bit cumbersome after a little while. But for now, let's just do it this way. Actually, I just spotted an error here. That should be import. Now, so because we are inheriting from app, we should make sure that we pull all those properties and methods through. So let's create an init function. It's actually a good practice, as suggested in the documentation, to also pull through the quargs, so the keyword arguments. Then we're going to inherit, so we use the super function From that, we take the init function, and again, good practice. Well, in this case, you actually need to pull through the keyword arguments. Sorry, they are usually called quarks, so let's stick to that convention. So now the idea is to actually build what's in the grid layout, because I have inherited from a grid layout. So I'm going to have columns. So I'm going to have 2 columns. Then I'm going to have a bunch of widgets. So I'm going to have a label. This is really to have a username and a password. I have a label that will show that, and then I will use a text input widget to actually receive the input from the user. So I'm going to have 2 columns because they'll be sitting next to each other. Label next to text input, label next to text input. Now the way a grid layout works is it will fill the 2 columns with the first 2 widgets it finds, and then it will move to the next row and do the same thing all over again. So you don't have to necessarily define where the widgets go in terms of rows in this particular case, because it will populate the widgets in such a manner that it fills the columns first and then moves to the next row. So the first thing to add is a widget. So I'm going to add a widget. What I'm adding a label. Now I haven't imported that yet, so I will do that in a second. So the text of that label is going to be username. Okay, now I'm going to be using labels and text inputs. So from Kivy UIX label, import label, and I'm also going to import text input. Right, so I've got those. So that's my widget added to the grid layout. Now I'm going to have to capture the output or whatever the user enters into my text widget. So I'm going to capture that this way. And then that's my widget, and it has a property that's the multi-line. I'm actually going to put that to false. Right. Now, importantly, this text input doesn't actually live on the grid yet. The only thing that this line is saying here is that my username variable captures whatever the user enters in here. It doesn't actually add the widget to the grid. So that's what we need to do next. So that's easy enough. We've done that before. So add the widget. And which one is it? Well, that's self username. Right. So that's the first row, if you like. We have a widget which is a label which shows username, and then we have a text input box that will then, because we've added it to the grid layout, will sit next to it because we work in columns. So I now want to create a second row with the password widget. So this will be password. Cool. Again, multiline is false. I'm not going to call this username, of course. I'm going to call this password. And then I'm going to add that to the grid layout. Right. Okay, let's have a look and see what that does. Not what I want. Of course, this needs to be equal. I'm mixing Kivy language and Python. So that's more like it. So we've got our label with a text input, and we've got the password for the text input. So this is what this little app looks like using purely Python to build it. So that's the first way you can do things. So the second way you can do this is to actually split the formatting, if you like, or the way things look from the functionality. So this is all about how the app looks, and that tends to be stuck in a Kivy file separately, just to control it separately. But there's a way of doing it, a second way of doing it, without actually having a Kivy file, And the way to do that is to use a multi-line string. So if we want to use a multi-line string, we're going to have to introduce a new functionality. It's called the builder. Now that is part of the Kivy language. So I from Kivy lang import, and it's called builder. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this builder to have a multi-line string, which will replace everything that's in here. And in that string, it uses the Kivy language structure. So you can see that we're moving towards a Kivy language file. So from builder, I'm going to load string, multi-line string, so 3 of them. Okay, and my object, or my root, was a grid layout. So grid layout. You use the same indentation as in a Kivy file, so I'm going to have 2 columns. I'm going to have my first label with text, user name. Okay, I'm going to then have text input, and I'm going to put multi-line to false. Oops, false. Okay, and so that is effectively doing these 3, right? I have my columns and then my first label and text input. Now I'm going to do my second row, which is replacing these 3. So I'm just going to copy that. Password and multi-line is false. Now then, of course, we no longer need this root widget because everything we're doing is already done in here. So this root widget, I'm going to comment that out for now. I'm not going to delete it just so that you can still see what was there before. Now, of course, remember in the build function, we returned this root widget, which I have now commented out. So I'm going to have to return this here because, of course, we need the root widget needs to be defined. It is in this string, so therefore I'm going to return, instead of root widget, I'm just going to return a grid layout. There you go. And let's have a look. And you can see the same app appears. So that is the second way of using Kivy without a Kivy file. Of course, you can see that we're effectively using Kivy language in a multi-line string. We're just not sticking it in a separate file. So clearly the next step is to stick this in a separate file. Now the first way of doing this, and I have seen it being used, but not very often, because it's just an extra step to remember. But so the documentation will explain to you that if you use a Kivy file of which the name is the same as your app name minus app, and all in small letters. So what that means is the name of my app is my app. If you drop the app piece of it, it will just be my. And if I make that all small, it will be my, basically, right? So if I give the Kivy file that name, it will automatically recognize that as the Kivy file. So let's do that. Firstly, you have to get out of presentation mode actually to do that. Right, so in my project, I'll create a new file. And this is not a Python file. So the name had to be, so my name was my app. I need to remove app and then do everything in small letters. So it has to be my, and then .kv. Okay. That's my Kivy file. I'm going to move this to the other screen, make this a little bit bigger. So effectively, this is then going to be just whatever was in the string, to be honest. So let's copy that across. The only thing that we really should add is the version of Kivy. So as a comment, well, it's not as a comment, it's with the colon as well. So Kivy 2.1.0. In my case, of course, you need to replace that with your version of Kivy. And then this is the Kivy language. So easy enough. So I no longer need this. I'm going to comment this out. Let's see how that goes. And there you go. It's as simple as that. Now, I have seen it being used, not very often, because people then need to remember the rule about what the name of the Kivy file needs to be. But it works, so that's one way of doing it. The next way of doing it is going back to this builder function, but using it in a slightly different way, where we refer to a file instead of a multi-line string. Okay, so we're going back to my builder function, but not load string. So I'm just going to, actually I'll just leave it just for reference. But so from builder, you load a file. I usually call it GUI.kv. Now that file doesn't exist yet, so we're going to have to create it. Also, the other thing I would say is if you leave my KV as it is, then the app will actually load the KV file twice. Once through this statement, and the second time because this is the name of the app minus app in small letters, and therefore it will also load that, so it will double up. So instead of recreating, I'm just going to rename this to GUI. Okay. So now it's telling me to load that file and then return the grid layout, which is in here. And there you go. So it's as easy as that. That's the second way of creating this app using a Kivy file. Now, the final way of doing that is actually having this builder statement being returned by the build function. And that's actually the way I've seen it being used most. So take that here, stick it there, and then you would think it works, but it will not. I'll give you an error. As in, not an error, but it won't show you anything. It'll show you a blank screen. Now, and this is where we have to come back to what we said at the start of the video, where at the very top we said this was the root of the widget tree. So you have to return the function, the build function has to return the root. Now, if you return it here, this file actually does not have a root. Okay, this is not a root. This is a kind of like the equivalent of a class, like a template, if you like. It is not the widget itself. So you have to then have a root widget, which is entered without the greater sign and the well, those two, whatever they are called. So you need to return a root. So now that should then work. There you go. And that is your app again. So that's the fifth way of creating that same app. So that was it. Thank you for your time. If you thought this was helpful or useful, please like my video or even consider subscribing. There will be more videos on Kivy and all kinds of lessons learned from Python apps that I've built. Thanks. See you soon. Bye.